Well, good morning. We are in the fifth week of Lent. We are peeking around the corner looking at Palm Sunday next Sunday. And as really the journey of Lent is beginning to peak, I want to kind of summarize where we may have been as we bring things into this beautiful image of Lazarus in the tomb in the gospel. First week of Lent, we talked about temptation, the reality of temptation, the fact that every one of us faces temptation. Temptation may have changed over the years. You may not be facing the same temptation now that you used to face, but whatever it looks like and whenever you are confronted by it, every one of us faces temptation. We also talked about in the story of Abram how we often have to wait on God. God does not always answer our prayers either when or how we want. There's some mystery in the gospel today, and we all, if we're honest with ourselves, respond to that in a variety of ways. Some of us still have questions of why that is, and some of us perhaps even have some quiet pockets of unresolved with the prayers that God hasn't answered at this stage of life. We had this beautiful story of the woman at the well who was stuck in her sin. And last week we talked about how we are to expose to God the things that are in the dark. And actually there's a common theme that runs throughout all those things. We're going to be tempted. We're most vulnerable to temptation either when we're struggling with God, when He's not answering our prayers, when we don't hear Him, when we don't see Him. And as we are most vulnerable to temptation, a lot of times we fall into sin. That's kind of like where we are in this story of Lent. Now today, Jesus is not in Bethany. He's not close to where Lazarus is. There's a couple things that I just want to lift up to you that struck me as I was reading the gospel, because I think it ties in. Almost all of Lent is here. Martha comes, Mary comes, the two sisters, they come to Jesus. They say, "Would you raise our brother from the dead?" And it says, and I quote, that Jesus loved, and so He remained for 2 days in the place where He was. Does Jesus go immediately? No. People are begging for Him to do something. These two women, their brother is going to die. They're on the edge of begging God for help. And Jesus does not go immediately. If you've ever kind of peered into that, there should be a part of that story that perhaps if we allow it to touch the personal places of our own hearts could be confusing. Because a lot of times, as we said weeks ago, when we cry out to God, sometimes God doesn't answer our prayers when or how we want, just like in today's gospel. What often builds up in our hearts, especially in our relationship with God, when God doesn't meet our expectations, when life doesn't meet our expectations, is resentment. So I love this part of the gospel where Jesus, as He is speaking to Martha, she says, Lord, if you would have been here, he wouldn't have died. What do you think was in that statement? I think what was in that statement was, I am so angry at you. You're a good man. All your words are good. They're all about love. Jesus, you said that we're to go to you. I love my brother. I was begging you to come. If you would have been here, he wouldn't have died. That's how I think it came out of her mouth. Jesus, of course, in the gospel is going to illustrate in the miracle that He has power over death, which is why He allowed things to unfold. But if you can let yourself feel the emotion of Martha, I think the resentment, the anger that's there, like, why didn't you show up? And then, of course, there's this beautiful part of the gospel where Lazarus is in the tomb. He's there for 4 days. And I love the line. It says, Jesus said, roll away the stone. And they said, Lord, by now there will be a stench. When something is dead, when something is dying, when it's decaying and it's locked up, you can imagine the aroma. And Jesus says to the family, I'm not afraid of stench. Open it up. In most of our lives, and most of us, if you just look back at life, we all have a tomb inside our heart. And for a lot of us, there's a place in our heart that's wide open to God, and God has access to it. But for some of us, there's a place of our heart where it's walled off. And that's where the stench is. In other words, that's where things are isolated from God. That's where the death is. And I want to lift up 3 things for us to consider today. Number 1, depending on where you are in the journey, maybe for some of us, what's been buried away over here is unconfessed sin. So for some of us, we're all at different places on the journey. If there is a habitual sin in your life, in fact, if there's a sin that you have given into so much, you just don't ever think you're going to beat it, you can't win. If there's a particular pattern that you keep falling into, then that is a place in our heart where the stench is growing. And I just want to look at you today and say, here's the good news. God is not afraid of stench. Jesus Christ knew what he was doing when he rolled away the stone. He knew what was going to happen. He went into the very places of death. And I just want to tell you today that if there's a place of unconfessed sin in your life, you don't have to be afraid. Jesus Christ is not afraid of stench. Amen? Number 2. For some of us, that's not where you are, and that's good. For some of you, you are working hard to kind of grow in holiness. You're listening day in, day out, week after week, and you're making small strides closer to God. But for some of us, not all of us, there might still be that one secret from your past. That one thing that happened 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago that you've never confessed. That secret. And that thing is buried way in the back of our heart. And that stone was closed 10, 15, 20, 50 years ago. And even though we think we've moved on, it's kind of festering in the back of our heart. And I just want to let you know today, you don't have to be afraid. Jesus is not afraid of stench, and he's not afraid of secrets either. The good news for all of us is if there's something in your past and you've locked it away, that's a part of your life that still has control over you. And I just want to look at you and say, don't be afraid. Jesus is not afraid of stench. Amen? Now, for some of us, we don't have a life of sin right now. For some of us, we don't have that unconfessed secret. But for a lot of us, if we have the courage to go here, which is what I think is one of the more influential things of life, resentment is a killer. I shared with you a couple months ago that I come face to face just with a pocket in my own heart where I didn't want to admit it to God and I didn't want to admit it to myself. But, day in, day out, life sometimes meets your expectations, sometimes it doesn't. People sometimes meet your expectations, sometimes they don't. But when life is big and you're really begging God, or the people who let you down, or the people who you either rely on the most or who are closest to you, that's where resentments can build up. And they're hidden. They're just kind of quiet little resentments. God didn't answer your prayer a long time ago, and you didn't say anything about it, but there's a little place of resentment like, why didn't you? Life didn't turn out the way you thought it would be in your first marriage or in this marriage, or your kids struggled when you begged God for them not to struggle, or your job didn't go the way it wanted, your health, whatever it is. I don't think I was aware of all the little bitty resentments that I had toward Him because they were kind of hidden. So I confessed all of the things that I resented about all 17 years of priesthood. It was powerful. And the more I started to think, man, the longer that list got and the worse I felt. But just all the little things. In all of my years of a priest, I just brought all that to Him and asking for blessing. But if Martha, today in today's gospel, had that kind of emotion around what He did not do with her brother, in all of your life, has God always done what you've asked Him to? Do you understand everything about God? And is there suffering, or has there been suffering in your life? Because if we haven't honestly shared how we feel about that to Him, then what's brewing all the way underneath our heart is a stench of resentment. Today, He looks at all of us and says, don't be afraid. I'm not afraid of stench. My encouragement, in fact, my invitation to all of us is that before Easter, we would all go to confession. You don't have to go here. You can go anywhere you want. If it's been a long time since you've been to confession, hey, that's okay too. But would you be willing to roll away the stone so that He, who is unafraid of stench, can have access to either sin that's not been confessed, to the secrets of our past, or to the quiet resentments that have built up over life? Let me ask you this. Would your life be better or worse if He came in and removed the stench? Would Easter be better or worse if you finally rolled away the stone? What prevents us from doing that, or at least what prevents me from doing that, is fear. And if you are afraid, I'll close with this. The antidote to fear is not courage. That's Hollywood. The antidote to fear is trust. I can be afraid of saying something or doing something, and if I am afraid, that I have to generate the courage and I have to exercise my will, but that's not the answer. The answer is relationship. When I trust He who, as we are about to celebrate, gave His life. Let me ask you this. Is there anything to be afraid of right here? What about this should we be afraid of? This kind of a person. A God who goes this far for us. What about this should we be afraid of? This Easter, this Holy Week, can we roll away the stone with our sin, our secrets, or resentment? Can we let him into the stench and hear his words to us? Be not afraid. Amen?